The first security officer grabbed Dorian Vale by the shoulder before the cabin door had even closed. The second twisted his arm behind his back while his 7-year-old son clung to his waist, sobbing into a worn teddy bear. At the front of the first-class cabin, CEO Celeste Marrow stood in an ivory suit, her finger pointed toward the exit as though she were removing a stain from her private aircraft instead of a frightened father and child. Passengers raised their phones. A flight attendant pleaded for calm. Dorian did not fight back, even when one guard shoved him against a seat and his son screamed for them to stop. He only stared toward the cockpit, where a silver-winged emblem had been painted beside the door, and whispered something no one understood. "Please tell the captain that Falcon 7 is aboard." Celeste laughed and ordered the guards to drag him out immediately, but seconds later, the cockpit door opened, and the pilot's face turned pale when he saw the men on his knees. What could a tired single father possibly have done to make a veteran captain abandon the controls and salute him with tears in his eyes? Before we continue, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Oxley Stories if you believe kindness and second chances can change a life. And tell us where you are watching from tonight, because somewhere across the world, someone may need to hear that a person's worth can never be measured by their clothes, their job, or the seat printed on their ticket. 3 hours earlier, Dorian had been kneeling on the floor of a crowded airport terminal, tying the frayed lace on his son's sneaker while departure announcements echoed through the glass and steel hall. His son, Leo, looked exhausted. The boy's cheeks were pale, and every few minutes he pressed a hand against the left side of his chest as though calming a tiny bird trapped beneath his ribs. They had spent the previous night in a plastic chair at a bus station after their connecting coach broke down outside Denver. Dorian had not slept at all. He had watched Leo breathe beneath his oversized jacket, counting each rise and fall while guarding the envelope hidden inside his own coat. That envelope contained medical records, a specialist's letter, and the last chance Dorian had to keep a promise made beside a hospital bed 2 years earlier. Yet when he checked the departure board, their flight flashed in red, "Final boarding." Dorian lifted Leo into his arms and ran. His work boots struck the polished floor with heavy, uneven thuds. His backpack bounced against one shoulder, filled with 2 changes of clothes, a plastic container of sandwiches, and an old photograph he had carried through 12 years of silence. Travelers moved aside reluctantly. Some stared at his faded charcoal shirt, the grease embedded beneath his fingernails, and the scar that ran from his jaw to his collarbone. To them, he looked like a mechanic who had wandered into the wrong terminal. No one could have guessed that he had once moved through airports under a different name, wearing a uniform and carrying the lives of strangers in his hands. Dorian had spent years making certain no one ever guessed, but on that morning, secrecy was beginning to cost his son something he could not afford to lose. At the gate, the door was already closing. Dorian called out, and a young employee named Priyasan glanced at the boy in his arms before stopping the gate agent from locking it. Their economy seats had been separated during an aircraft change, she explained apologetically. Leo had been assigned to the last row, while Dorian's seat was near the wing. Dorian's expression tightened, but he did not raise his voice. He simply asked whether anything could be done because his son had a heart condition and could not safely sit alone during takeoff. Priya searched the system, frowned, and finally printed 2 new boarding passes. A passenger in business class had missed the flight, leaving 2 adjoining seats near the front. She upgraded them without charge, telling Dorian that no father should have to choose between following airline policy and holding his child's hand. It was the smallest act of kindness Dorian had received in months, and he thanked her as though she had given him a fortune. Neither of them knew that the change of seats would place him directly in the path of one of the most powerful women in aviation. Celeste Marrow had built Marrow Meridian Air into a luxury charter empire. Her company transported celebrities, diplomats, technology executives, and wealthy families who wanted the convenience of private aviation without owning aircraft. She was celebrated in magazines as fearless, disciplined, and self-made. Her employees knew another side of her. Celeste tolerated no delays, no public embarrassment, and no reminder that money could not control everything. That morning, she had commandeered one of her company's aircraft for a promotional flight to Seattle, where she planned to announce a merger worth nearly $900 million. Journalists, investors, and senior executives filled the first-class cabin. Every detail had been designed to display perfection, from the flowers near the entrance to the gold stitching on the headrests. When Dorian stepped aboard carrying a sick child and a battered backpack, Celeste saw not a passenger but a disruption. The first confrontation began over a seat. Celeste's assistant, Bram Kessler, informed Dorian that the pair had been placed in seats reserved for the CEO's legal advisors. Dorian showed the boarding passes and calmly explained that the gate agent had reassigned them. Bram barely looked at the documents. He told Dorian there had clearly been a mistake and ordered him to move to the rear. Leo had already fastened his belt and was staring anxiously at the growing crowd. Dorian asked whether the legal team could use the available seats in the next row, but Bram's face hardened. He leaned close enough for Dorian to smell mint on his breath and warned him not to create a scene in front of the company's owner. That threat would have intimidated most people. Dorian had faced worse than anger in expensive clothing, yet he knew one wrong reaction could get them removed, so he lowered his voice and repeated that his son could not sit alone. Celeste heard only the refusal. She crossed the aisle with the sharp confidence of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. Her gaze moved over Dorian's clothes, his scar, and the child clutching a teddy bear with one missing eye. She did not ask about Leo's condition. She did not inspect the boarding passes. She simply announced that the aircraft belonged to her company and that she could decide who sat where. Dorian replied that the aircraft might belong to her, but the ticket had been issued legally and his son's safety was not negotiable. A hush fell over the cabin. Celeste's executives looked away, not because Dorian had been disrespectful, but because almost no one contradicted her. For one brief moment, something uncertain flickered behind her expression. Then an investor lifted his phone to record, and Celeste's pride chose the next move for her. She ordered the onboard security officers to remove Dorian and Leo. The guards hesitated. Both were contractors trained to prevent threats, not settle seating disputes. Celeste declared that Dorian was behaving aggressively, though he had not left his seat or raised his hands. Bram supported her claim, adding that Dorian had entered first class under suspicious circumstances. Several passengers had seen the new boarding passes, but no one spoke. Dorian looked around the cabin and realized how quickly silence could turn a lie into an accepted truth. He had spent years teaching Leo that good people eventually stepped forward. Now his son was watching an entire cabin remain seated while strangers prepared to pull his father away, and the lesson was beginning to collapse. The first officer reached for Dorian's arm. Leo panicked and wrapped both arms around him. His breathing grew shallow, and the color drained from his lips. Dorian immediately stopped resisting and told the guard to let him reach his son's medication. The officer misunderstood the movement toward his backpack and tightened his grip. The second guard pulled Dorian into the aisle. Leo slipped from the seat and fell to his knees, still clutching the teddy bear. Celeste flinched at the sound but did not withdraw her order. Instead, she told the crew to remove the child as well. That was when Dorian saw the silver-winged emblem beside the cockpit door. It had been 12 years since he had last seen that symbol. The emblem belonged to a rescue squadron that no longer existed, a unit erased from official news reports after a mission the government refused to discuss. Falcon 7 had been Dorian's call sign. He had buried it with the uniform in a locked metal trunk after returning home to discover that the woman he loved had died while he was missing. Only a handful of pilots knew what had happened in the mountains that winter, and fewer still knew Dorian had survived. Yet the emblem on the cockpit suggested that someone aboard remembered, and in desperation, he spoke the old words aloud. The captain heard them through the open audio feed from the cabin. Captain Alaric Voss had been completing final checks when the phrase reached him, "Falcon 7 is aboard." His fingers froze above the controls. For 12 years, those words had lived inside his nightmares. He removed his headset, ignored the first officer's confused question, and opened the cockpit door. From the threshold, he saw Dorian restrained between two guards. He saw the scar along his neck. He saw the same dark eyes that had looked through burning snow and ordered Alaric to leave him behind. For a moment, the polished aircraft cabin vanished, replaced by a mountain valley, a broken wing, and the sound of men crying for rescue. Alaric stepped into the aisle and spoke Dorian's full military rank before saluting him. The guards released Dorian so abruptly that he nearly fell. Celeste stared at the pilot, certain she had misunderstood. Alaric did not lower his hand until Dorian slowly returned the salute. Tears gathered in the captain's eyes as he told the cabin that the men they were throwing off the plane was the reason he and 17 others were alive. A murmur swept through the passengers. Phones lowered. Bram stepped backward. Celeste's face lost its certainty, but before anyone could ask what Alaric meant, Leo made a soft choking sound and collapsed against the seat. Dorian dropped beside him. His hands moved with disciplined speed despite the terror in his face. He opened Leo's backpack, found the medicine, and checked the boy's pulse. The flight attendant brought oxygen while Alaric called airport medical services. Leo's eyes fluttered open, and he whispered that he was sorry for causing trouble. Those words struck the cabin harder than any accusation. A 7-year-old child believed his failing heart had created the humiliation around him. Dorian pressed his forehead to the boy's and assured him that none of it was his fault, yet his own voice broke. The specialist appointment in Seattle was less than 4 hours away. Missing it could postpone Leo's surgery for months. The hospital had already warned Dorian that another severe episode might make the procedure impossible, so how could he choose between taking his son off the aircraft for evaluation and continuing toward the doctor who might save him? The paramedics arrived and stabilized Leo near the gate. They advised that the boy could travel if his oxygen level remained steady, but only with close monitoring and minimal stress. Celeste stood several feet away, unable to meet Dorian's eyes. For the first time, the cabin's attention was not admiration she could use. It was judgment. She began to apologize, but Dorian stopped her with a quiet request: he needed the aircraft to depart. Celeste had expected anger, perhaps a threat or a demand for compensation. Instead, the men she had publicly humiliated cared only about reaching his son's doctor. The simplicity of that request exposed the ugliness of everything she had done, but the consequences were not finished. Air traffic control had placed the aircraft on a departure hold because of the medical response. The delay was expected to last 40 minutes, long enough to jeopardize the appointment. Captain Alaric contacted operations and requested priority clearance. The dispatcher refused, explaining that severe weather was closing routes into Seattle. The flight might be cancelled entirely. Dorian listened without speaking, his hand resting on Leo's shoulder. In his coat, the hospital letter seemed to grow heavier. For 11 months, he had repaired farm machinery at night, delivered packages before dawn, and sold the small house his wife had loved to pay for tests not covered by insurance. He had arrived at the final step, only to have the sky itself close in front of him. Then Alaric remembered the one route through the storm that ordinary commercial pilots would avoid. The northern corridor crossed rugged terrain and required manual navigation through unstable winds. Alaric had flown it only once, years earlier, with Dorian beside him in a military transport. He told operations they could take the corridor if conditions remained within limits. The dispatcher reminded him that company policy prohibited it. Celeste could authorize an exception, but doing Southwest would place the merger flight, the aircraft, and her reputation at risk. Every executive turned toward her. Only an hour earlier, she had insisted ownership gave her total authority. Now that authority demanded something more difficult than controlling a seat. It demanded courage. Celeste approved the route. She ordered her legal advisors to reschedule the merger meeting and instructed the cabin crew to convert the front lounge into a resting area for Leo. Then she removed her ivory jacket, knelt beside the boy, and asked whether he would let her carry his teddy bear while Dorian helped him lie down. Leo looked at her cautiously. He remembered the pointing finger and the command to remove them. After a long silence, he placed the bear in her hands, but he warned her that its name was Captain Buttons and that it did not like being shouted at. A few passengers laughed through their tears. Celeste did not. She promised the bear would be treated with respect, and although the gesture could not erase what she had done, it became the first small crack in the armor she had worn for years. As the aircraft climbed, thunderheads towered over the windows like black mountains. Leo rested beneath a blanket while Dorian watched the oxygen monitor borrowed from the airport clinic. Alaric sent word asking Dorian to visit the cockpit once they reached cruising altitude. Dorian refused at first. He had not entered a cockpit since the mission that ended his career, and even the smell of aviation fuel could pull memories from places he kept locked. But turbulence began to shake the aircraft, and Alaric sent another message, this time saying he needed help. Dorian looked at his sleeping son, then followed the flight attendant toward the silver-winged door. Inside, warning lights glowed across the instrument panel. The storm had shifted faster than predicted, blocking the northern corridor with violent crosswinds. Alaric's first officer proposed turning back, but the nearest safe airport was now behind a wall of weather. Dorian studied the radar and recognized a narrow valley hidden beneath the cloud formations. During the old rescue mission, he had discovered that the valley created a temporary wind shadow when storms approached from the west. The route was not marked on civilian charts, and a navigation error of less than a mile could lead them toward rising terrain. Alaric asked whether the passage would still be there after 12 years. Dorian answered that mountains did not move, but men sometimes forgot how to listen to them. Then he took the observer's seat and began calling headings. The sight of Dorian inside the cockpit stirred a story Alaric had never been permitted to tell. 12 years earlier, their military transport had been carrying medical volunteers and injured civilians away from a remote region when an explosion damaged the tail. The aircraft crashed during a blizzard. Alaric had been trapped with a broken leg while fuel spread toward the burning engine. Dorian dragged him through shattered metal, returned for the others, and organized their survival for 3 nights in temperatures far below freezing. When a rescue helicopter finally reached them, enemy fire forced it to leave after taking only the wounded. Dorian remained behind to guide the aircraft away from the survivors. The official report listed him as missing and presumed dead. Yet 6 weeks later, he walked into an Allied outpost alone, half-starved and carrying the identity tags of 3 men he had been unable to save. He refused medals, interviews, and promotion. He asked only to go home. Home had already changed. Dorian's wife, Maëlle, had gone into premature labor after being told he was dead. Complications took her life, but their infant son survived. Dorian returned not to a celebration but to a hospital nursery, where a nurse placed a sleeping baby in the arms of a man still wearing bandages from war. He named the boy Leo because Maëlle had written the name in a letter she never got to send. From that day, Dorian stopped being Falcon 7. He became a father who warmed bottles at midnight, learned to braid the hair of his sister's children for practice, and worked whatever jobs allowed him to attend medical appointments. The nation might have considered him a hero, but Leo knew him only as the man who checked under the bed for monsters and always gave him the larger half of a sandwich. Celeste heard the story from a flight attendant who had overheard Alaric explaining it to the crew. She sat alone across from Leo, holding captain buttons in her lap, and stared at Dorian's empty seat. Her own father had founded the small charter company she later transformed into Mero Meridian. He had been a gentle pilot who knew every mechanic by name and sometimes delayed flights for families in distress. Celeste had loved him, but after his death, investors told her kindness was weakness. She survived by becoming harder than everyone around her. Each successful deal reinforced the belief that compassion was a luxury leaders could not afford. Yet the men she had tried to remove from her aircraft had survived war, grief, poverty, and single parenthood without surrendering his humanity. What had her hardness helped her survive, and what had it slowly destroyed? The aircraft entered the valley shortly before the storm closed behind it. Clouds swallowed the windows, and turbulence threw passengers against their belts. In the cockpit, Dorian called out each turn from memory. Alaric trusted him without hesitation. Celeste moved beside Leo and held his hand when the boy woke frightened. He asked where his father was. She told him Dorian was helping the pilot guide them through the storm. Leo smiled faintly and said his father always knew how to find the way home. The words were innocent, but they unsettled Celeste because she suddenly understood that leadership was not making people fear losing their place. It was becoming the person others trusted when the route disappeared. Then the left engine warning sounded. A lightning strike had damaged a sensor, and the first officer could not determine whether the engine itself was failing. The aircraft began losing altitude. Alaric prepared for an emergency diversion to a small regional airfield, but landing there would leave them hundreds of miles from Seattle. Dorian studied the readings and noticed that the engine temperature remained stable. The warning likely came from the sensor, not the turbine. He advised against shutting the engine down, but civilian procedure required the crew to follow the alert. Alaric had seconds to decide whether to trust the manual or the men who had once pulled him from a burning aircraft. He trusted Dorian. The engine continued running. Minutes later, the clouds broke, and the gray Pacific appeared beyond the mountains. The cabin erupted in relieved applause, but Dorian remained still. From the cockpit window, he could see the storm falling behind them, and for the first time in 12 years, the sound of an aircraft had not carried him back to the crash. It had carried his son toward hope. Alaric placed a hand on his shoulder and told him that perhaps Falcon 7 had never truly disappeared. Dorian looked toward the cabin and replied that the call sign belonged to another life. Yet when he returned to Leo, the boy raised both arms and called him his pilot, and Dorian's guarded expression softened. They landed in Seattle 26 minutes before the specialist's appointment. Celeste had arranged an ambulance to meet the aircraft, but when Dorian tried to lift Leo, the boy's oxygen level dropped again. Medical staff rushed aboard. The specialist, Dr. Yara Belloon, had been contacted during the flight and was waiting at the hospital. She ordered Leo taken directly into surgery preparation rather than the clinic. The emergency episode had revealed that the defect in his heart was worsening faster than expected. The operation planned for the following month had to happen that day. Dorian climbed into the ambulance with nothing but his backpack and the teddy bear, unaware that the next obstacle would be one he could not overcome through courage alone. At the hospital, an administrator explained that the surgical team required financial authorization before beginning the specialized procedure. Dorian's insurance had approved most of the cost, but an experimental valve was excluded. The unpaid balance was more than he earned in 3 years. He offered the money from selling his house, only to learn that it covered less than half. He called the lender who had previously rejected him. He called former employers, military assistance offices, and every person whose number remained in his phone. Some promised to try. Others apologized. The clock continued moving while Leo lay behind glass doors asking when his father could come inside. Celeste arrived at the hospital with Alaric. Dorian assumed she had come to protect her company from a lawsuit. He told her he had no intention of suing and asked to be left alone. Celeste placed a folder beside him. Inside was confirmation that Mero Meridian had paid the entire remaining cost, along with travel, rehabilitation, and housing near the hospital. Dorian's first response was anger. He did not want his son turned into a publicity story or his own humiliation used to repair a reputation. Celeste accepted the accusation without defending herself. She explained that no cameras had been contacted, no press release would be issued, and the payment came from her personal account. Then she admitted the truth she had avoided since the plane. She had looked at a tired man in work clothes and decided his dignity mattered less than her schedule. Paying the bill would not make them equal, but perhaps it could prevent her worst decision from becoming a child's final day. Dorian searched her face for calculation. He saw only shame. Before he could respond, the surgical team called him to Leo's room. The boy wore a hospital cap that was too large and held captain buttons beneath his chin. He asked whether Dorian would be there when he woke. Dorian promised he would. Leo then looked toward Celeste and asked whether she could wait too, because Captain Buttons had decided she was not entirely mean. A fragile laugh passed through the room. Celeste covered her mouth, and tears spilled before she could stop them. She had spent years receiving awards without feeling half the worth contained in that reluctant forgiveness. The surgery lasted 9 hours. Dorian sat beside a dark window as evening settled over Seattle. Alaric remained with him. Celeste canceled the merger presentation and stayed as well. During the long wait, Dorian finally opened the old photograph in his backpack. It showed Miles standing beside a small training aircraft, one hand resting on her pregnant stomach. Celeste recognized the airfield. Her father had owned it before creating the charter company. Miles had once worked there as a dispatcher. Dorian explained that she had met Celeste's father during a storm delay and had never forgotten his kindness. When Dorian was declared dead, Celeste's father quietly paid Miles' hospital bills and arranged transport when complications began. Dorian had carried the photograph because a handwritten note on the back said, "One day, return this kindness to someone who has nowhere else to turn." Celeste stared at her father's handwriting. She had seen the same slant in birthday cards and flight logs, but she had never known what he had done for Dorian's family. Her attempt to remove Dorian from the aircraft now felt like a betrayal stretching across generations. Her father had helped Miles when she was alone. Years later, his daughter had nearly abandoned Miles' husband and child at a gate. Celeste broke down, not with the controlled tears of someone worried about reputation, but with the grief of a daughter who realized she had spent years building the opposite of her father's legacy. Dorian could have used the moment to condemn her. Instead, he turned the photograph over and told her that a legacy was not a path one could never leave. It was a direction one could choose again. Near midnight, Dr. Belloon entered the waiting room. The operation had succeeded, but Leo's heart had been weaker than scans suggested. The next 48 hours would determine whether his body accepted the valve. Dorian thanked the doctor, then sat beside his son in intensive care, listening to machines perform the rhythm he had spent years fearing would stop. Celeste and Alaric left before dawn, but every morning afterward, fresh food appeared outside Leo's room with no company logo and no note. On the third day, Leo opened his eyes and asked why everyone looked so tired. On the fifth, he walked 6 steps while holding Dorian's hand. On the seventh, he handed Captain Buttons to Celeste and told her she could borrow him whenever she felt afraid. The video from the aircraft eventually reached the internet. A passenger had uploaded the confrontation before learning the full story. Millions watched Celeste order security to remove Dorian. Commentators demanded her resignation. The board of Mero Meridian scheduled an emergency vote, and advisors urged her to issue a statement blaming the guards and gate staff. Instead, Celeste released the unedited security footage, including her own words, and accepted full responsibility. She announced that she would step away from daily leadership while an independent review examined passenger treatment, accessibility, and security practices. She also revealed that every employee, from cleaners to pilots, would receive the authority to challenge an executive order if a passenger's safety or dignity was at risk. Investors warned that the decision might cost her the merger. Celeste replied that a company not worth improving was not worth expanding. The board expected Dorian to testify against her. He did appear at the hearing, but he refused to let the story end as a simple punishment. He described what Celeste had done, without softening it, then described what she had done afterward, without dismissing it. He told the board that accountability mattered because people could change only after facing the harm they caused. Removing Celeste forever might satisfy public anger, but requiring her to rebuild the system could protect more families. His testimony did not rescue her reputation overnight. It did something harder. It gave her a responsibility she would have to earn every day. Months passed. Leo grew stronger. The pale gray color disappeared from his face, and he began running short distances in the park near their rented apartment. Dorian accepted a position as director of emergency flight training at Mero Meridian, though only after insisting that he report to an independent safety committee rather than Celeste. He designed scenarios that taught crews to recognize medical distress, de-escalate conflict, and question assumptions. Priya, the gate employee who had upgraded Dorian and Leo, was promoted to lead a passenger advocacy program. The 2 guards were retrained rather than discarded, because Dorian believed people who had followed a bad order needed to learn how to refuse the next one. Captain Alaric invited Dorian to fly again. At first, Dorian said no. Then one clear morning, Leo brought him the old silver-winged emblem and asked whether heroes were allowed to be scared. Dorian answered that fear was often how a person knew something mattered. He climbed into the co-pilot's seat of a small training aircraft while Leo watched from the hangar with Celeste and Captain Buttons. As the wheels left the ground, Dorian felt Miles' absence beside him, sharp and tender, but he also felt something else, not escape from the past, but permission to carry it differently. 1 year after the incident, Mero Meridian opened the Mile Vale Family Flight Center, a nonprofit service transporting children with serious medical conditions to specialist hospitals. Celeste refused to put her own name on the building. The first aircraft bore a small silver-winged emblem near the cockpit and the words, "No passenger left behind." Dorian became the program's chief pilot. On the inaugural flight, Leo sat in the front row holding Captain Buttons while another frightened child and her mother boarded behind him. When the girl hesitated at the door, Leo offered her the teddy bear and said the pilot always knew how to find the way home. Celeste watched from the aisle, wearing no designer jacket and carrying luggage for a family who had arrived late. She and Dorian were not suddenly best friends, and forgiveness had not erased what happened. Their relationship was built through honest disagreement, repaired policies, and hundreds of quiet choices no camera recorded. That was what made it real. Redemption had not arrived as a grand speech in the hospital. It had arrived each time Celeste listened before judging, each time Dorian chose guidance without surrendering accountability, and each time a frightened passenger was treated as a human being rather than an inconvenience. The central mystery of Falcon 7 eventually became public when Alaric petitioned the government to recognize the rescue mission. Dorian accepted the medal only because Leo asked to pin it on him. At the ceremony, reporters called him a national hero, but Dorian looked down at his son and said the bravest thing he had ever done was not surviving the mountain. It was returning home and learning to live after losing the future he had imagined. He had believed courage meant carrying everyone alone. Leo had taught him that sometimes courage meant allowing others to help. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like and share the video, subscribe to Oxley Stories, and send it to someone who may be carrying a burden no one else can see. Your support helps stories of compassion, accountability, and second chances reach people who need them most. Special request, comment, no one should be left behind. If you believe dignity belongs to every person, no matter what they wear, where they sit, or how powerless they may appear. Years later, Leo kept the torn boarding pass from that terrible morning inside a frame above his desk. Beside it rested the silver-winged emblem and a photograph of Dorian, Celeste, Priya, and Captain Alaric standing in front of the medical transport aircraft. Visitors sometimes asked why he preserved a reminder of the day his father was nearly dragged off a plane. Leo would explain that the boarding pass did not remind him of cruelty. It reminded him of what happened after cruelty was confronted. A pilot opened a door. A proud woman admitted she was wrong. A frightened cabin found its voice. A father returned to the sky. And a little boy who once believed he caused trouble grew up knowing that his life had never been an inconvenience. On the final flight of Dorian's career, he guided the aircraft above a layer of clouds glowing silver beneath the sunrise. Leo, now a young medical student, sat in the co-pilot's seat. Celeste was in the cabin accompanying a family to surgery, just as she had done hundreds of times before. Alaric's old Falcon 7 patch was fixed above the instruments. As the horizon brightened, Dorian remembered the day security hands closed around his arms and an entire cabin seemed willing to watch him disappear. He had thought the most important recognition came when Alaric stepped from the cockpit and called him a hero. He had been wrong. The moment that changed everything came later, when Celeste knelt beside his son, accepted the teddy bear, and chose to become better than the person she had been moments before. Because sometimes the person being dragged toward the door is the one who once carried everyone else to safety. Sometimes the person giving the cruel order is not beyond redemption. And sometimes one opened cockpit door is enough to reveal the truth that pride tried to hide. Every stranger has a history, every life has value, and no one should have to prove they are a hero before being treated like a human being.